12 innocent nuns, all declared pregnant. No men, no contact with the outside world. So, how did it happen? This wasn't just a scandal, it was a spiritual earthquake. A sacred monastery sealed from sin suddenly turned into a place of accusation, shame, and silence. And behind it all, a man of the cloth, with a terrifying secret. If you believe truth should always win over power, subscribe now and stay with us till the end. This story will shake your faith and restore it. Nestled deep in a secluded valley of the Appalachian Mountains stood the St. Benedict Monastery, its stone walls cloaked in ivy and wisdom. Silent witnesses to more than a century of prayers whispered into the void. The crisp morning air of early November clung to the trees like memory, sharp, still, and solemn. Frost etched delicate patterns on the stained glass windows of the chapel, and a hushed reverence blanketed the monastery grounds like a sacred veil. Within the thick stone walls, time seemed to slow. Days at the monastery were shaped by the rhythm of devotion, 5 daily prayers, chores, silence, simplicity. The world outside had moved on, paved with noise and chaos, but within these cloisters, life remained as it had been for generations, structured, serene, and untouched. Or so it seemed. Mother Superior Mary had overseen this sacred haven for over 2 decades. At 56, her face bore the subtle lines of a woman who had wept often, but always in private. She was revered among the sisters not just for her unwavering discipline but for her quiet compassion, often expressed in acts so small they were nearly invisible, folding the blanket left out by a tired nun, leaving an extra slice of bread beside the bowl of soup. She knew each nun by name, by heart, and by the depth of their personal journey toward God. On this particular morning, like many before it, the chapel bell rang out across the silent monastery grounds, its echo rolling through the valleys like a calling. The sisters, clad in their simple black habits, moved silently from their quarters, their footsteps muffled on the old stone. Their eyes were lowered, hands tucked into their sleeves, rosaries swaying gently at their hips. There was no chatter, no haste, only a solemn procession toward prayer. The chapel itself was dimly lit, save for the morning light filtering through the stained glass, casting hues of crimson and gold across the altar. Candles flickered gently beside the crucifix, their flames bending as if in silent worship. The scent of incense lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of old wood and stone. Mother Mary stood before the altar, her hands clasped before her chest. She cleared her throat, and the sisters bowed their heads as she began the morning prayer. In nomine Patris et Filia et Spiritus Sancti. The words had barely left her lips when it happened. A gasp, sharp, sudden, like a blade slicing through silence. It came from the third pew. Sister Lucy. She was the youngest among them, only 22, with porcelain skin and eyes that often wandered beyond the cloister walls. Though quiet, she carried a gentleness that drew the others to her. But now, her face had gone pale, her body trembling. She clutched her abdomen with one hand, the other gripping the edge of the pew as if the ground beneath her had shifted. Then she collapsed. A thud echoed through the chapel, so out of place in the sacred space that it startled even the candles. Sister Agnes, seated beside her, instinctively caught her before she hit the floor completely. "Lucy?" she whispered, though the fear in her eyes betrayed her composure. Mother Mary hurried forward, her composure giving way to urgency. She knelt beside the young nun, checking her pulse, brushing damp hair from her forehead. Lucy's breathing was shallow. Her lips trembled, and tears welled in her unfocused eyes. Without waiting, Mother Mary turned to Sister Teresa and Sister Anna. "Take her to the infirmary," she said firmly. "Now." The other nuns watched in stunned silence as Lucy was lifted and carried away, her limp form draped between 2 sisters. Their prayers were forgotten. Their eyes followed the procession until the chapel doors closed behind them. In that moment something had cracked. An invisible shift had taken place. Something sacred had been disturbed. The remainder of the prayer was never completed. Word traveled quickly within the cloister walls. Though they did not speak often, the nuns' eyes told stories their lips could not. Whispers were unnecessary. The silence had become heavy, expectant, tense. Dr. Raymond arrived an hour later, summoned from the nearest village. He was a man of calm demeanor and thinning gray hair who had served the monastery for over a decade. He knew their ways, their silence, their unwavering routines. He had seen fevers, infections, even a broken leg from a slip in the garden. But this was different. When he emerged from the infirmary, his face was pale, as though he had looked upon something he couldn't comprehend. Mother Mary met him in the hallway. "What is it?" she asked, voice steady. Dr. Raymond hesitated. He glanced toward the closed door behind him before lowering his voice. "She's exhibiting signs of pregnancy." The words didn't register at first. Mother Mary blinked. "That's not possible. I thought the same," he said. "But the symptoms are consistent. Nausea, abdominal swelling, hormonal changes. She's early, but the signs are there." "No man has entered this monastery in years," Mary replied coldly. "No one." "I know," Raymond whispered. "But the signs are undeniable." He looked at her, searching her face for something, understanding perhaps. But all he saw was a growing storm in her eyes. "We'll have to examine the others," he added quietly. "It may not be isolated." Mother Mary stood very still. In that instant, her entire world, the sacred world she had so carefully preserved, trembled beneath her feet. "I will gather them," she said at last. As the bell rang again, calling the sisters to the great hall, a chill swept through the monastery. The morning sun had hidden behind clouds, casting long shadows across the cold stone floors. The nuns filed in, their faces pale, eyes anxious. They sat in rows, as if waiting for a sermon, but instead of a sermon, they were met with silence. Mother Mary stood before them, hands folded, her voice trembling with something more than emotion. "We are not here to judge," she began, "but to understand." They listened, they waited, and though none dared say it aloud, a single question burned within each heart. What if it wasn't just Lucy? What if something had broken the sacred seal of this holy place? What if the silence they had lived in was about to be shattered? Forever. In the hours that followed Sister Lucy's collapse, a peculiar quiet spread through the halls of St. Benedict Monastery, a stillness unlike the reverent silence they had known for years. It was heavier now, tense, as though the stone walls themselves were holding their breath. Mother Superior Mary remained composed on the surface, but beneath her veil of calm, thoughts churned like dark water in a sealed well. The monastery had always been her fortress of faith, a place where purity and peace reigned, where the sins of the world were kept at bay by discipline and prayer. But now, that sanctuary trembled, vulnerable to a threat it could neither name nor see. The infirmary, once used sparingly for minor ailments, had become the epicenter of unease. Sister Lucy lay in a narrow bed, her breaths shallow but steady. A candle flickered beside her, its light dancing over her pale face. Sister Agnes sat nearby, her rosary clutched tightly in her hands, lips moving silently in a prayer that had become more desperate with every hour. Then came another shock. Sister Teresa, one of the older nuns, approached Mother Mary in the hallway. Her hands trembled as she spoke. I have been feeling ill, lightheaded, nauseous." Mary studied her for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "Since when?" Teresa hesitated. "Several days." She wasn't the only one. By the afternoon, 3 more sisters came forward, Anna, Beatrice, and Helen. Each described similar symptoms: fatigue, dizziness, strange changes in appetite. All women in the prime of health, all cloistered within the same walls, all bound by sacred vows that, if broken, would mean the shattering of everything they believed in. Dr. Raymond returned that evening, his medical bag heavier this time. He was no longer just treating an isolated illness. Now he was searching for a pattern, an explanation. One by one he examined them: blood pressure, temperature, gentle pressing on the abdomen. His movements were careful, clinical, but his eyes betrayed what his words refused to confirm. The results came slowly, like whispers through thick curtains. Elevated hormone levels, abdominal swelling, consistent symptoms, signs of early pregnancy. Mary stood motionless as he relayed each finding. Her mind, trained for decades to lead with grace and clarity, now reeled with the weight of something she could not justify. No one had entered this monastery. No man, no visitor, not even a delivery boy. They lived in seclusion, walled off from the world. By choice and by discipline, the only external contact came through pre-approved charitable work, carefully supervised. No opportunity for sin, no crack in the armor. So how? She looked at her sisters differently now. Not with judgment, but with fear. Fear that something terrible had slithered past their defenses. Whispers began to pass through the corridors, not as spoken words, but through glances and silence. Nuns who had lived together for years now lowered their eyes when passing each other. The comfort of communal prayer was fractured, the songs of devotion sung with uncertainty. The once warm kitchen now felt cold and hollow. Meals were eaten in near silence, with the scraping of spoons against ceramic echoing louder than ever before. Sister Helen, the youngest, barely touched her food. She sat hunched, her fingers nervously curling into her sleeves. Across from her, Sister Anna tried to meet her eyes, but the girl stared blankly at her bowl. One evening, Mother Mary walked the halls long after the others had retired. She needed to think, to breathe, to pray. She paused in the small library, where dim candlelight touched the spines of sacred texts worn with time. Kneeling before the altar in the adjoining prayer room, she tried to pray, but no words came, only questions. Was this a test, a punishment, or something else? She rose before dawn the next day and summoned the entire convent to the great hall. Her voice was firm but calm as she stood before them, her figure draped in the dark folds of her habit, her presence commanding. "I have ordered full medical evaluations for all sisters," she said. "This is not a punishment, it is a necessity." Some nodded, others froze. Fear had nested in their hearts. Dr. Raymond returned, accompanied by 2 nurses from the village hospital, both discreet, both trusted. The examinations began at midday. Mother Mary remained at the edge of the hall, overseeing the process with an expression that betrayed nothing, even as her heart fractured with every new report. The first 3 examined, symptoms. Then 2 more, then 4. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, the number had reached 12. 12 women of God, 12 sacred vows, 12 signs of pregnancy. Mary dismissed the others for the evening. She sat alone in the chapel as night fell, the stained glass now just dark shapes above her. She tried to find solace in the sacred, but it eluded her. The silence no longer soothed her, it accused her, whispered of failure, of shame, and somewhere deep within her, an old fear began to rise, a fear she thought she had long buried, that no matter how high you built your walls, the world would always find a way in. Or worse, something far darker. The following morning arrived without the comfort of birdsong. The sky hung low, heavy with gray clouds, casting a suffocating shadow over the monastery. Cold wind pressed against the windows like the breath of something unseen. Inside, the once harmonious sanctuary of Saint Benedict had grown unrecognizable, its silence no longer peaceful, but heavy with dread. The news had spread among the sisters, though none dared to speak of it aloud. 12. The number sat like a curse upon their shoulders. Some tried to carry on as before, rising early, tending to their duties, reciting their prayers, but the routines now felt empty, like echoes of a faith that no longer felt intact. Sister Beatrice sat alone in the chapel long after morning prayer had ended. Her hands trembled as she clutched her rosary. Every breath was a question, every blink a doubt. Had she done something unknowingly? Had she failed God? She wasn't alone in that torment. Around the monastery, invisible fissures were widening. Sister Teresa avoided eye contact with anyone, her movements stiff, her face pale. Sister Anna had taken to spending long hours in the garden, kneeling in the damp soil, her fingers pulling weeds with feverish precision, as if by cleansing the earth she could cleanse herself. And Sister Helen, she no longer spoke at all. Once the sweet, hopeful voice of the younger generation, she now drifted through the corridors like a ghost, her face blank, her eyes hollow. Mother Mary watched it all unfold with the restraint of a seasoned leader, but the grief of a mother. She had built this monastery as a haven for the faithful, a place untouched by the chaos of the outside world, and now it had become a ground zero of suspicion and shame. What wounded her most was the growing distance between the sisters. Where once there had been laughter, warmth, and quiet companionship, now there were only closed doors and quiet tears behind them. Then came the whispers beyond the walls. They started with subtlety, a strange glance from a visiting courier, an uncomfortable pause in the voice of a village merchant. Then came the rumors, loud, vulgar, and persistent. They say 12 of them are with child. It's unnatural. What goes on behind those holy walls? I heard one of the priests sneaks in at night. They're no better than the rest of us. The villagers had long regarded the monastery with reverence, seeing it as a sacred stronghold far removed from their mundane lives. But now, the distance that had once fostered respect was breeding fear and contempt. Stones appeared at the monastery gate, placed there not by accident, but with meaning. Harsh words were etched into wooden signs and left at the entrance: sin, betrayal, lies. Mother Mary found the first sign herself. She picked it up without a word, studied its crude lettering, and placed it face down on the ground. She said nothing to the others. But her eyes, those calm, knowing eyes, were no longer steady. She knew that what had begun as an internal crisis was now spiraling beyond the walls. 2 days later, The echo of hooves on the cobblestone path signaled an arrival no one had expected, but perhaps should have. Bishop Gregory. He dismounted with precision, his heavy cloak catching the wind like a flag of judgment. At 65, he was a tall, austere man with eyes that had long since forgotten how to soften. He believed in purity, ruthlessly. His reputation stretched far beyond the region. Where he walked, fear followed, and so did silence. He was accompanied by 2 senior clerics and 3 assistants. They wore expressions not of inquiry but condemnation. Mother Mary stood at the gates to greet him, her hands folded respectfully. "Your Excellency," she said calmly, "we weren't expecting." "Clearly," Gregory interrupted, his voice sharp. "When shame walks freely in daylight, someone has failed to guard the flock." The words fell heavy, like a sentence already passed. Mary did not flinch. "We are investigating the matter with all seriousness, but the cause remains unclear." Gregory stepped past her without permission, entering the grounds as if reclaiming them. "The cause is sin, Mother Mary," he said over his shoulder. "You've allowed your sisters too much freedom, and now the devil walks among them." The sisters gathered in the courtyard, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices. They stood in line, eyes wide, habits clinging tightly to their trembling bodies in the cold wind. The bishop's gaze moved over them with disdain, as though he were inspecting soldiers who had deserted their posts. He turned to the clerics beside him. "We will interview each one, privately, isolate them if necessary." Mother Mary stepped forward. "They are not criminals, they are suspects," Gregory replied. "And if they are guilty, they will be excommunicated." No one moved, no one spoke. Only Sister Helen let out a small, involuntary whimper before biting it back. That evening, the interrogations began. The great hall was transformed into a courtroom without mercy. One by one, the nuns were called in. Most returned pale and shaking. Some cried, others didn't speak at all. The bishop did not need a confession. Suspicion was enough. Appearances were enough. Truth, it seemed, was irrelevant. In the chapel, Mother Mary remained on her knees long after midnight. She had weathered storms before, poverty, illness, even death. But this storm, this one sought to destroy not just her, but the very soul of her community, and outside the wind howled through the valleys like a lamentation, as if the mountains themselves wept for the innocents being stripped from the walls of St. Benedict. The great stone walls of St. Benedict, once protectors of sacred solitude, had become cold observers of unraveling souls. What had begun as whispers was now a roar, quiet on the surface but deafening within. Faith, once the glue that held the sisterhood together, was starting to crack under the relentless pressure of shame and suspicion. The interrogations did not end. Day after day, the nuns were summoned, one by one, to face the stern faces of Bishop Gregory and his accompanying clergy. Questions were asked, not with curiosity, but with accusation. They weren't meant to uncover truth. They were meant to coerce confession. "Speak, and the church may forgive you," one of the priests intoned repeatedly, like a hymn gone sour. But what was there to confess? Most of the sisters had never so much as held a man's hand. Their days were filled with scripture, their nights with prayer. And now they were being asked to admit to sins they did not commit, told that their swelling bellies and hormonal changes were not signs of manipulation, but of betrayal. Mother Mary fought quietly, behind the scenes. She pleaded for reason, for time, for further investigation. But her authority had been effectively stripped. Bishop Gregory had assumed full control of the monastery's operations for the sake of the church's dignity, as he claimed. The nuns began to withdraw into themselves. Sister Agnes wept silently in her bed at night, pressing her rosary so tightly against her palms that it left indentations. Sister Teresa spent hours scrubbing the same corner of the hallway, her mind lost in a desperate ritual of cleansing. And Sister Beatrice, the once smiling soul of the group, stopped singing altogether. Sister Helen, the youngest, was the most visibly shaken. Her silence had deepened into detachment. She no longer responded when spoken to, only stared blankly ahead, as though awaiting judgment from a God she no longer understood. Then came the papers. It began subtly. A parchment slid across the table during an interrogation, a priest's hand holding a pen, a quiet whisper, "Confess, and the world will forget. Deny, and you will be cast out." The wording was deceptively gentle, acknowledgement of error, a promise of forgiveness. But beneath the ink was a threat as old as power itself. The first to sign was Sister Anna. She resisted at first, trembling under the weight of uncertainty. But the idea of losing everything, the monastery, her sisters, her place in God's house, was more than she could bear. Her hands shook as she took the pen. When Mother Mary found out, she said nothing. She only stared out the chapel window that night, her breath fogging the cold glass, her heart heavier than it had ever been. It wasn't just the act of signing. It was what it symbolized, the beginning of collapse. More followed. Sister Teresa, exhausted and guilt-ridden, gave in next. Her face was pale, her voice flat when she handed over the signed confession. "I didn't do anything," she whispered, "but maybe God is punishing me for something else." It was how they got to them. Not through proof, but through fear, through doubt, through the unbearable weight of being called unclean in a world that demanded purity. Sister Beatrice refused. When she was presented with the document, she stood slowly, looked each priest in the eye and said, "If I sign, I betray not just myself, but every woman who walks the path of truth." They threatened her, told her she would never step foot inside a church again, that her name would be wiped from the record of sanctity. She walked out without another word. But the damage had already been done. The sisterhood was no longer united. Those who had signed avoided the eyes of those who hadn't. Some cried in corners, others fasted for forgiveness they didn't need. The air was thick with blame, spoken and unspoken. Mother Mary moved through the corridors like a shepherd without a staff. Her words could no longer protect her flock. Her prayers felt unanswered, and worse, her silence, once a source of strength, now felt like surrender. Late one night she entered the chapel and found Sister Helen sitting alone on the floor, knees drawn to her chest, rocking slightly. Mary approached quietly, kneeling beside her. Helen whispered, barely audible, "Am I going to be sent away?" Mary placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "No one is sending you anywhere." "But I didn't do anything," Helen said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I didn't even talk to anyone. Why is this happening to me?" Mary had no answer. She simply held her, both of them wrapped in a silence that was no longer sacred, but broken, wounded, afraid. Outside, the trees groaned in the wind, and the mountains held their vigil. Within the heart of St. Benedict, faith did not die in one violent moment. It faded, slowly, painfully, under the crushing weight of unjust accusation. And no one, not even the most faithful, knew how to stop it. The final days of November crept into the monastery like a shadow, wrapping the ancient stones in damp air and bitter silence. The trees beyond the walls had shed their last leaves, and the sky held the color of iron. Inside, the weight of the unspoken was heavier than the stone arches above their heads. The sisters no longer moved together. They had become islands, drifting through narrow hallways and prayer chambers without meeting one another's eyes. Trust, once the marrow of their community, had dissolved into suspicion and fear. Mother Mary watched helplessly as her sisters crumbled beneath the pressure of accusation. She saw how Sister Agnes avoided the chapel, how Sister Teresa flinched at every creak in the floorboards. She heard the soft weeping that slipped beneath closed doors at night, and the prayers that had grown more desperate, more pleading. She bore it all in silence, hoping that somehow it would pass. But pain, left unspoken, has a way of turning inward. It was Sister Helen who broke first. The youngest among them, barely 20, Helen had been the symbol of hope, innocent, tender, brimming with quiet joy. But the burden was too much for someone so unprepared for darkness. She had signed nothing, she had spoken little, but her soul had been stretched too thin. It happened just before dawn. Sister Beatrice found her. The young nun was lying near the stone wall beside the east corridor, her head bleeding, a dark stain seeping into the fabric of her habit. She had struck the wall, deliberately. Her small frame curled against the cold floor, eyes glassy, lips parted in a silent cry that had never made it out. Beatrice screamed. The sound ripped through the monastery like lightning. Doors flung open, footsteps pounded against the stone, and for the first time in weeks the silence broke, but not with prayer. Mother Mary rushed to the scene, heart thundering against her ribs. She knelt beside Helen, her fingers searching for a pulse that fluttered, weak and uncertain. "Get Dr. Raymond," she said, voice sharp with urgency. The doctor arrived within the hour, face pale, hands steady. He cleaned the wound, bandaged the head, and administered what little he could. But the damage had already been done. Helen slipped into unconsciousness, a fragile thread tethering her to the living. The sisters gathered outside the infirmary, wrapped in shawls and sorrow. No one spoke. Some wept openly, others stared at the floor, lost in their own fears. Inside, Mother Mary sat beside Helen's bed, her hand resting on the girl's fragile wrist. The monitors ticked softly. A single candle burned on the table nearby, its flame steady, unwavering. She felt her own breath faltering. This was her fault, not the rumors, not the bishop, not even the hysteria, but her silence. She had hoped that by remaining composed, by obeying, by waiting, truth would rise. That faith would be enough. But faith, without action, had left Helen broken on the floor. Outside, the bells rang for morning prayer, but no one moved. The sacred rhythm of their lives had been shattered. Later that day, Bishop Gregory summoned the sisters to the great hall. His voice was colder than ever, laced with contempt. "This incident is proof of guilt," he declared. "Guilt weighs heavy on the conscience. It always finds a way to surface." Mother Mary rose slowly from her seat. For the first time in weeks, she spoke with power. "You will not speak of Sister Helen in such a way," she said, her voice even, but fierce. "You will not turn her suffering into a tool for your authority." The bishop's eyes narrowed. "You forget yourself." "No," she replied. "I have remembered who I am." The room fell into stunned silence, and in that moment something shifted. The women around her, weary and broken, felt the first stirrings of something unfamiliar, resistance. Not in anger, but in truth. That night, Mary returned to the chapel alone. She lit a candle for Helen, then knelt before the altar. No prayers came, no whispered pleas. Only a promise, silent and sacred. She would no longer be silent. She would no longer obey fear, not while injustice ruled the house of God. And somewhere beyond the chapel walls, the wind shifted. It was not yet hope, but it was no longer despair. Far from the stone corridors of St. Benedict Monastery, the small village of Norcroft sat wrapped in mist and silence, untouched by the fury that brewed behind the monastery's gates. It was here that Father John received the letter, a folded parchment, marked with a single wax seal bearing the emblem of the Holy Mother. The courier who delivered it said nothing, only placed it in his hand and walked away. Father John retreated into the rectory, his heart uneasy. The handwriting was familiar, precise, steady. Mother Mary. He broke the seal with a small blade, and as he unfolded the paper, the scent of old ink rose into the air. The letter was brief, but heavy with urgency. It told of injustice, of silent suffering, of a truth being buried beneath holy walls, and at the end, a plea: "Find the truth, before we are buried beneath the lie." John read it twice, then folded it again and placed it inside his coat. He left that evening. By sunrise, he was riding along the northern path, wind biting at his robes, eyes scanning the frost-covered land ahead. The monastery lay miles to the east, but he would not go there yet, not until he understood what he was walking into. Instead, he turned south, toward the outskirts of Norcroft, where an old friend practiced medicine in quiet solitude, Dr. Emil Grant. Emil had once served as a physician to the archdiocese but had chosen to live outside its influence. He was a man of sharp mind and quiet principles, one of the few Father John trusted without reservation. The doctor opened the door before John even knocked. "I heard about the monastery," he said simply. "Come in." The hearth inside burned low, casting flickers of light across the shelves, lined with medical texts and faded relics from years of service. John removed his gloves, his face tense. "I need your help," he said. Emil poured 2 cups of tea, motioning toward the worn armchair beside the fire. John recounted everything he knew, from the sudden illnesses to the signs of pregnancy, from the forced confessions to the quiet desperation etched in Mother Mary's words. When he finished, Emil sat in silence, the tea cooling between his hands. "You believe something's been done to them," the doctor said slowly. "I believe someone wants it to look like they've sinned," John replied. "But they haven't. Not those women. I've known Sister Beatrice since she was a child. I baptized Helen myself." Emil nodded. "Then let's start with what we do know." He stood and retrieved a thick volume from a nearby shelf, Endocrine Disruptions and Hormonal Anomalies. Flipping through it, he paused at a page marked with a faded ribbon. "There are substances," he said, "that can mimic the symptoms of pregnancy. Certain synthetic hormones, when introduced in small doses over time, especially in food or drink, can cause fatigue, nausea, even changes in breast tissue and abdominal swelling." John leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Could it be done deliberately?" "Yes," Emil replied, his voice grim. "And if administered carefully, it could be nearly undetectable without a specific test. Most doctors wouldn't think to look for it unless they were searching." John felt a coldness settle into his bones. "What would you need to confirm it?" "Blood samples," Emil said, "from at least one of the affected women, and ideally access to their daily food or drink supply. If hormones were introduced that way, we may still find traces." The pieces were beginning to shift, not yet falling into place. but no longer scattered. Father John sat back, staring into the fire. He thought of the quiet agony in Mary's letter, the image of Sister Helen, barely breathing on a cold stone floor, the frightened eyes of women told to confess or be cast into the darkness. And underneath it all, something else, an itch in the soul, a warning from the divine. Someone had orchestrated this, someone with knowledge, access, motive. As he rose to leave, Emile handed him a small kit. "If you can get the sample, I'll run the tests myself." Quietly, John nodded, placing the kit beneath his cloak. "I don't know who I'm fighting yet," he said softly, "but I will not let them bury these women." Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering brittle leaves across the frozen ground. Father John mounted his horse, turning east toward the monastery, not as a priest answering a summons, but as a man walking into the shadows with eyes wide open. And in the distance, unseen hands moved chess pieces on a board cloaked in holy smoke. The sun was just beginning to sink behind the jagged ridges when Father John reached the base of the mountain trail leading toward St. Benedict. He did not take the main road. Instead, he followed an old shepherd's path that curved behind the monastery's orchard wall, used only by villagers decades earlier. The path was narrow, cloaked in brush, and almost forgotten, perfect for someone who didn't want to be seen. He waited until dusk turned the sky to iron and shadows deepened into night. Then he lit no lantern, made no sound. He moved with the urgency of a man carrying more than a secret. He carried the weight of lives unseen. At the base of the rear wall, he paused. 2 quick taps on a stone, a pause, then 1 slow knock, just as instructed in Mother Mary's letter. For a long moment, there was only the wind. Then, a shift. The small wooden door near the storage cellar creaked open an inch, and a whisper floated out. "John?" He recognized the voice. "Sister Anna," he breathed. "It's me." The door opened wider, and Anna pulled him inside, quickly closing the entrance behind them. Her face was pale, her eyes hollowed by sleeplessness, but within them flickered a trace of hope. "She's waiting," she said, and without another word, led him through the darkened corridor. They passed through a disused cellar, beneath the kitchen, and into a hallway sealed at both ends. There, in the faint light of a candle, stood Mother Mary. She hadn't aged in the 2 weeks since he had seen her last, but the lines on her face seemed deeper, as if grief had been etched into her with invisible ink. Still, her eyes were clear, her voice steady. "You came," she said, almost in disbelief. "Of course," John replied, stepping forward. "And I bring more than comfort. I bring a path forward." He opened his cloak and revealed the small medical kit Emile had given him. Mary exhaled slowly, not quite relief, not quite resolve. "Then we must act quickly." The infirmary was now guarded by Gregory's men, and the sisters were under surveillance. So they had chosen an alternative, Sister Beatrice. She had refused to sign the confession. She had spoken only truth, and she had volunteered to be tested, even if it meant risking punishment. "She's waiting in the old reading room," Mary said, guiding John forward. The room had not been used in years. Dust covered most of the furniture, but a single chair had been cleared. Beatrice sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as John entered and offered a faint smile. "I'm not afraid," she whispered. "You shouldn't be," John replied gently. "The truth is not your enemy." With practiced hands, he withdrew the vial, the alcohol swab, the needle. The candlelight danced across the glass. As he approached, Beatrice rolled up her sleeve, revealing a thin arm and faint bruises, signs of the stress and mistreatment endured in silence. He swabbed, pierced, and collected the blood into the vial. 1 sample, 1 chance. Mary took the vial carefully, wrapping it in cloth and placing it into a small pouch Anna would carry back down the mountain at dawn. And then, just as they were about to depart, they heard it. A noise. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching from the corridor. John froze. Beatrice's breath hitched. Mary turned to Anna. "Take the kit. Now." Anna didn't hesitate. She slipped through a hidden passage behind the bookcase, the pouch clutched tightly to her chest. The door burst open a second later. It was Father Vincent. He stopped short at the sight of them, his eyes scanning the room, landing on the open medical kit, the needle still uncapped on the table. Silence settled like a knife. Then, softly, he asked, "Do you have any idea what they'll do to you if they find out?" Mary stepped forward. "We are not hiding sin, we are uncovering it." Vincent looked away, jaw tight. "They'll tear this place apart." "They already have," Beatrice whispered. For a long time, Vincent said nothing. Then he walked slowly to the door, paused, and without turning back, said, 10 minutes. That's all I can give you." And he left. John turned to Mary, astonished. "He's afraid," she said simply. "But fear is not loyalty." They extinguished the candle, locked the kid away, and scattered. 10 minutes later, Vincent returned, escorting a guard to the reading room. It was empty. The next morning, Anna reached the base of the trail, the vial still secure. She didn't stop until she reached Dr. Emil's door, and when he held the vial up to the light, he said only, "This will tell us everything." But within the monastery, a new shadow had begun to stir. That night, someone placed a folded note beneath Mother Mary's door. 5 words. "They're watching Sister Teresa now." Mary read it twice, then burned it by candlelight. The enemy was no longer only outside. Someone within the fold had joined the hunt. Dr. Emil Grant worked in silence. His study, tucked into the rear of his modest home, had been turned into a makeshift laboratory. The blood sample sat under the microscope, a single drop holding within it the possibility of redemption or devastation. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, tapping branches gently against the windows, like fingers from another world. Emil adjusted the lens, his face taut with concentration. He had run this kind of analysis before, in hospitals, clinics, even battlefield tents. But never had a test felt so heavy, so morally weighted. Father John sat in the corner, arms crossed, silent. He dared not interrupt. His eyes remained fixed on the flickering flame of the oil lamp, but his mind roamed far. He thought of Beatrice's steady hand as she offered her blood, of Mother Mary's burning resolve, of Sister Helen lying unconscious, and of the 12 women branded with suspicion, stripped of dignity under the guise of piety. The room held its breath. Then Emil leaned back. "It's not pregnancy," he said flatly. John looked up. "There's no sign of natural conception," Emil continued. "But her progesterone levels are abnormally high, unnaturally high. The same goes for the presence of a synthetic compound that mimics HCG, the hormone detected during early pregnancy. This was introduced from the outside." John's breath caught in his chest. "You're certain?" "As certain as science allows," Emil said. "Someone has been dosing them." He stood and began pacing slowly. It would have to be consistent. Repeated exposure over several days, perhaps weeks. The effects mimic pregnancy almost perfectly, especially if the subject is unaware. Psychologically, the body leans into the suggestion. John exhaled slowly, trying to absorb the implications. "Then it's a setup." "Yes," Emil said, "and a sophisticated one. Whoever did this had knowledge, both medical and logistical. They knew what to introduce and how." John's mind raced. The food, the water, the communal structure of the monastery made it easy. One compromised supply, perhaps during transport or preparation, could have affected them all. But why? Why frame a convent of devout women? Why desecrate something so sacred? John returned to the rectory that evening, carrying the report tucked safely beneath his robe. But peace eluded him. The confirmation of foul play was only the beginning. Now he had to trace its roots. He pulled out old diocesan records buried in the church's archives. The shelves were dusty, the books brittle, but somewhere among them lay the answers. He began with the medical logs, anything that referenced hormonal anomalies, group illness, or disciplinary action involving female orders. For hours he combed through pages, eyes aching, fingers blackened by ink and dust. Then he found it. A report, dated 20 years prior. Convent of St. Magdalene, Diocese of Millcrest. Suspicion of group transgression. 12 nuns removed, monastery closed. John frowned. The symmetry struck him. 12 nuns. Collective punishment. No medical details recorded, only a short statement from the bishop overseeing the investigation. Gregory. His breath stilled. He flipped a page. There it was, case closed. Bishop Gregory recommends dissolution of order. No further inquiry. No evidence. No defense. Just silence and dissolution. John sat back, stunned. The pattern was undeniable. It had happened before, and now it was happening again. He pulled the lamp closer, scanning the rest of the file. A note had been added in the margin, scribbled years later in a different hand. One survivor, placed in isolation, declined to speak, record sealed. One name remained, Sister Madeleine. John recognized it faintly, an older woman, once part of the diocesan care home in North Hollow. He had met her only once, years ago. At the time, he hadn't known her past, but now she might be the last living witness. He stood abruptly, gathering his notes. The night outside had turned black, but John moved with purpose. He wrote a message to Emil, sealing it with care, then prepared for travel. He would leave at dawn for North Hollow. Somewhere, buried in Madeline's memory, might be the truth Gregory tried to erase, and if she spoke, it could unravel everything. Back at the monastery, the wind howled louder, and behind the chapel walls, Mother Mary knelt in prayer, not for mercy but for strength. She did not yet know what Father John had uncovered, but soon the past would return, and it would demand justice. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Father John set out toward the northern hills. The road to North Hollow was long and uneven, flanked by frostbitten trees and fields abandoned to winter. A faint mist clung to the earth, the air brittle with silence, yet his mind surged with urgency, driven not by fear but conviction. Today, he would meet the last thread of a mystery buried for decades. Sister Madeline. He remembered her vaguely, a stooped woman with clouded eyes and trembling hands, hidden away in the diocesan care home. She had been a figure of silence, barely speaking when he last passed through the facility years ago. But if her silence had once protected her, now it might protect others, if she chose to break it. When John arrived, the care home receptionist led him down a quiet corridor. The hall smelled faintly of dried flowers and disinfectant. It was peaceful, but hauntingly so. Forgotten prayers seemed to linger in the walls. "She's lucid on good days," the nurse whispered. "Today seems promising." The door creaked open. Inside, Sister Madeline sat by the window, wrapped in a pale shawl. Her hands rested on her lap, folded with the solemnity of a woman who had learned to carry pain in silence. Her gaze drifted toward the sunlight, but when she turned to face him, something stirred. Recognition, perhaps, or simply curiosity. "Father," she said softly, her voice thin but intact. "You've come." John knelt beside her, gently placing a hand over hers. "I need your help, sister. Innocent lives are at stake again. The past is repeating itself." She blinked slowly. A long pause followed. Then she nodded. "I knew someone would come," she whispered. "But I prayed it wouldn't have to be you." He waited, pushed nothing. 20 years ago, she began, her voice steadier now. "I belonged to the convent of St. Magdalene. It was a place of serenity, of discipline, until the changes began." She looked out the window again. "We didn't know what was happening at first. We felt strange, fatigued. Some of us, our bodies changed. Bloated, confused, rumors spread. Accusations came next. The bishop at the time, Gregory." John's jaw tensed. "He claimed we had sinned, that our condition proved our betrayal to our vows. We denied it, but no one listened. There were no tests, no evidence, only exile." She turned her face back toward him. "I was one of them, one of the 12, like your nuns now." He used the same number, perhaps to mirror his success. "But I survived." "Why didn't you speak?" John asked gently. "They said if I did, they'd come after the others. I was told to remain silent or bear the guilt of what might follow, and in truth, I was afraid, not of Gregory, but of disbelief. I had no proof, only my word." Her voice cracked slightly, but she did not cry. "I watched the others die in shame, alone, cast out, their names erased from church history." John took a deep breath, fighting the surge of emotion rising in his throat. "Do you remember any details? Anything concrete?" She nodded slowly. "There was a man, a doctor, brought in by Gregory, said he was verifying our condition, but he didn't examine us properly. He only watched. Later, I found a vial, hidden in the pantry." "A vial?" John asked. "Empty, labeled in Latin. I remembered the name. It matched a synthetic hormone I once read about in medical literature, back when I trained as an herbalist in my youth." She reached toward her nightstand drawer and pulled out a faded notebook. The pages were yellowed, but inside was a carefully preserved label. John stared. It was the same compound Dr. Emile had identified. "We are not alone in this, sister," John said. "Your testimony, it could vindicate them." She looked up at him, a soft defiance in her eyes. "Then take this," she said. "Let the truth be known. Let them stop hiding behind collars and titles. Let them see that faith cannot be used as a weapon." He accepted the notebook with trembling hands, a sacred relic from a buried truth. "You are brave," he whispered. "No," she said with a tired smile, "just ready to be heard." As John left the room, snow had begun to fall gently outside. But for the first time in weeks, his steps felt lighter. The truth no longer rested on suspicion alone. It had voice, memory, evidence. Gregory's web was unraveling. When he returned to the village, Father John met Emile in the chapel's anteroom. "She confirmed everything," John said, handing over the notebook. "Same substance, same pattern. 20 years ago." Emile flipped through the pages, nodding grimly. "This is enough to force a review." especially with her sworn testimony. "We have to act fast," John said. "He'll move quickly once he suspects." That night, as the village lay wrapped in the hush of snow, a meeting was called. Father Alphonse, Emile, several village elders, even a few of the church's junior clergy attended in secret. John laid out the documents, the blood work, Madeleine's testimony. Each word was met with silence. Then Alphonse spoke. "We must present this to the council," he said, "but not quietly. It has to be public, irrefutable." John nodded. "They have to see it for what it is. A crime against innocence, a manipulation of the faith." Emile closed the notebook. "I'll come with you, and so will Madeleine, if her health allows. We'll testify." The plan was set. In 2 days they would return to St. Benedict's, not in hiding, not in fear, but bearing truth like a torch. A cold dawn greeted St. Benedict Monastery as Father John rode up the winding path with his companions, Dr. Emile and Sister Madeleine, silent except for the creak of saddle leather and the distant toll of the chapel bell. Snow had fallen the previous night, cloaking the monastery in white, creating an almost surreal contrast between beauty and the tension that hung in the air. They dismounted near the front entrance, where guards, Gregory's men, stood stiffly, their breath visible in the frigid air. The trio approached deliberately, known by reputation more than presence. Every step was measured, every heartbeat audible in their own ears. Inside, the great hall had been prepared not for conflict, but for confrontation. A long wooden table stood between 2 lines of chairs, cleared for those who carried witness and evidence. At one end sat Bishop Gregory, flanked by his clergy, and awaiting an audience he assumed would confirm his righteousness. Mary and 5 nuns who had refused to confess watched from the shadows, faces pale, bodies tense with hope and fear. They had barely slept last night, but their resolve burned brighter than ever. John entered first, carrying the faded notebook Sister Madeleine had entrusted to him. Emile followed with a small satchel containing the blood report. Madeleine walked last, leaning on a cane, her presence fragile but strong. Gregory stared at them, disbelief etched into his lined features. "Father John," he began, voice brittle, "we gather in sorrow, not celebration. What brings you here?" John moved forward to stand before the table. He cleared his throat softly, voice steady. "We bring truth," he said simply, "evidence that contradicts your accusations. That proves our sisters were not pregnant, but instead poisoned systematically to appear so." A murmur rippled through the assembled clergy. To face poisoning when there had been no apparent threat from outside would shatter every assumption. Emile stepped forward, placing the blood test results gently on the table. "Dr. Emile Grant, sir," he said. "This vial, analyzed yesterday, reveals synthetic hormones, progesterone analogs and HCG mimic. There is no pregnancy." He gestured to John, who laid the notebook beside the vial. "And here is the record from 20 years ago in Millcrest," John continued, "signed by Bishop Gregory himself. It details the same manipulation, the same number of nuns, the same deception." Shock rippled through Gregory's circle. The priests glanced at each other, uncertain. Madeleine steadied herself and stood. "I was there," she said quietly. "I'm the survivor who did not speak. These words are true." The room fell into stunned silence. One of Gregory's closest advisors inhaled sharply, his eyes searching Gregory's expression. The bishop's face reddened, not with anger but fear. "How dare you accuse me?" Gregory hissed. "I am the bishop here, chosen by God." "You were chosen to serve God," John replied with quiet conviction, "but you used that power to destroy innocent sisters, to manipulate their bodies and their reputations. Shame and confession became your tools." Mary stepped forward, voice unshaken. "These women have suffered. They have been dismissed, shamed, made to question their vows and their faith. We ask for justice, not merely for vindication, but to prevent this ever happening again." Another priest cleared his throat. "The villagers are divided. Some believe them, others stand with the bishop." John nodded. "Let them listen to evidence. We propose an open investigation by an independent council, educated, impartial experts, to review all testimony, blood tests, past records, and to reaffirm the innocence of these sisters." Gregory's jaw clenched. "The council votes tomorrow," he said coldly. "Until then, the monastery remains under my oversight." John met his gaze. "May truth guide the vote." A hush fell over St. Benedict Monastery as dawn broke the following morning. The world outside stirred. Church bells chimed, farmers began their day, and villagers whispered in hushed tones near the gates. Inside the sacred walls, tension pulsed like a living thing, waiting to be acknowledged. Father John entered the great hall early, finding Mother Mary and Sister Beatrice seated side by side. Beatrice's face, once pale and withdrawn, now held quiet determination. Mary held her hand gently, solidarity in every touch. "We must prepare our case," John murmured, opening his satchel filled with documents, the blood test results, Sister Madeleine's notebook, correspondence, and notes from Dr. Emile. Mary nodded. "Let them see every page." Outside, the villagers gathered in small clusters. First came hesitation, curiosity leavened with doubt. But as word spread that John would present evidence, and that the evidence was scientific, and endorsed by a survivor, the crowd began to shift. Eyes once filled with suspicion now softened to empathy. A subtle gesture here, a woman removing her rosary and pressing it in her pocket. A neighbor quietly placing flowers near the gate. "Maybe we were wrong," an older man said to his friend. "Maybe they've been victims." Inside, the great hall brimmed with both hope and fear as the independent council members arrived. 2 doctors, a legal scholar, and a respected layperson from the diocese. They took their seats long before the sisters even entered. Their presence was silent validation that this was no longer a secret trial but a matter of justice and truth. When the sisters walked in, their heads held higher than before, a hush rippled across the assembled crowd. They had not come to beg, they had come to reclaim. John began. Without theatrics, he laid out the evidence. Meticulously recorded lab results, pages from Madeleine's notebook naming the hormone, historical documents implicating Gregory twice. He spoke with measured emotion, each word chosen to match the solemnity of the moment. The doctors examined the vial. Leafing through the notebook, they exchanged glances. One lifted her pen, taking notes. Mary stepped forward, her voice steady but warm. "These women were betrayed by someone who held power," she said. "They lost more than their reputations. They lost themselves. We stand here not to humiliate anyone, but to restore dignity." A gentle murmur of agreement rose from the council table. Outside, villagers watched from the courtyard. Some wore expressions of shame, others of renewed respect. A mother held her child, offering a soft explanation. They were telling the truth all along. Gregory sat at the far end of the hall, rigid, his gaze shaved across every document that John presented, every page of handwritten anguish. He had expected incredulity, resistance, but not undeniable truth. When the doctors asked for samples, blood records, historical files, Mary provided each item carefully, as though each were a sacred relic. The council studied them, nodding gravely. An hour passed. The sun shifted west, casting long shadows through stained glass. It was time. One of the doctors, an endocrinologist, spoke first. "We confirm the presence of synthetic hormonal agents. This is scientific confirmation that symptoms were induced. There was no pregnancy." The legal expert reviewed the historical documents. These records suggest a pattern of misconduct, mirrored events involving a single bishop 15 to 20 years apart. The case warrants ecclesiastical and legal review. The layperson closed his eyes, then opened them. These women deserve restoration, publicly, and the bishop, if found guilty, must be removed from office. A collective exhale filled the room. The council's words carried weight. The data, scientific and historical, were before them. The room cracked open, and light poured in. Gregory rose, voice shaking with restrained fury, anger no longer hidden behind ecclesiastical calm. "This is fabricated evidence," he protested. John approached him, calm. "The evidence is not mine, it is yours," Father John replied softly. Gregory glanced at Madeleine seated across the room. Her frail figure met his gaze. In that moment something shifted in his eyes, not defiance, but fear. He looked away. He would not speak. The council rose. Their decision would be announced publicly later that day. The room emptied, leaving behind documents, laments, and newfound resolve. In the courtyard, women stepped forward toward Mother Mary and the sisters. A few embraced, others took hands, tears glistening in the chill air. A farmer apologized directly to Sister Beatrice. His hands shook. "I judged too quickly," he whispered. She nodded. "We understand." In a corner, Father Alphonse and Father Vincent observed quietly. Their faces held relief tinged with disbelief. The seeds of reform were taking root. John looked at Mary. "This is only the beginning." She nodded. Beatrice's slight smile and restored posture echoed with possibility. Justice, once dormant, had begun to bloom. As the last rays of sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the great hall, something profound settled over St. Benedict Monastery. Not silence, not mere resolution, but the first flicker of true peace. Mother Superior Mary stood beside Father John at the edge of the monastery's courtyard. Behind them, the once ostracized sisters now walked among their people again, not as exiles, but as beacons of resilience. Their quiet smiles, though tinged with sadness, held the unmistakable glow of dignity reclaimed. A soft breeze rustled through the chapel bell ropes. For the first time in months, the bell chimed not to announce judgment, but to signal hope. Inside the monastery, the council began preparing their public declaration. The villagers, though uncertain of what came next, lingered, not out of suspicion, but solidarity. In the distance, Bishop Gregory stood alone, the weight of his own deception finally crashing in. He had lost control, and with it, the illusion of righteousness he had once worn so easily. Mary turned to John. "Tomorrow, they will speak the truth aloud." John nodded. "And the world will hear it." But even as justice stirred within those ancient stone walls, Mary knew this was not the end. It was merely the opening of a final chapter, a reckoning yet to come. Because redemption, like faith, requires more than truth. It requires action and sacrifice. The night descended slowly over St. Benedict, carrying with it a solemn promise: darkness may come, but it cannot remain. Not while truth still stands.